Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers, coast to coast, the Gulf to the 51st state, and around the globe. Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. On all the video channels, like around the earth, the planet Earth. And folks, pass the link on if you think you like this show. Pass it on to people who need this information, because this information that I bring you and the thoughts that I bring you, for you to decide. I don't tell you how things are. I just kind of give you the dots and let you connect them and tell you what I'm thinking. Folks who need to know, which is about everybody, given the state of the world, the United States, North America, this hemisphere, the whole 9 yards. Yeah, knowledge is power, and it will protect you, your physical safety, your financial safety, the safety of your property, whatever that may be, and your freedoms. So, in this show, we're not going to do the real estate show. I was going to do it either this show or the next in a few days, but there's more data coming in over the next week or two, which will be able to present a much better picture of regions, different types of real estate, what's going on, etc. There's no sense jumping the gun and then going back and patching up the numbers, if you know what I'm saying. But I am going to bring you exactly what I promised, which is the historical events that led up to World War I, the first Great War, and the second largest conflagration in the planet's history behind World War II, which World War I was really the setup for. Because history has this nasty habit of repeating. I mean, even more than rhyming, as you'll see. And hopefully none of this comes to pass, but I will let you be the sole determinant of what you think may happen here in the near and short-term intermediate future. We're going to start off, however, with our, shall we say, our founder's quote, except it's from Ron Paul. And I'm not a huge Ron Paul fan. I like him. I like a lot of his ideas. I do like Rand Paul quite a bit, although, once again, not 100%. But he had a great quote. Truth is treason in the empire of lies. Think about that. Truth is treason in the empire of lies. Now, we certainly saw that in the last 4 years of Obama's third term with Cadaver. We're going to have that as little current events, rat-a-tat-tat, before we get into our history lesson, if you will, this year. This show. I like that quote. I like that quote a whole bunch. And it's going to be real apropos if, for some reasons, the folks who are Americans and believe in the Constitution don't keep the seats of power in 2028. Yeah, 2028 is coming, folks. Believe it or not, we're just about 6 months into Trump's term. This is May 30th in the evening. I'm doing good and getting 2 shows out a week, so I'm kind of halfway there. I like to get a show out on Friday and Monday, Tuesday, somewhere in there. So this will be Saturday. So I'm close. How's that? Does close win the race or whatever? The rant story. Okay, so I've been kind of keeping you up to speed on the weather, the water conditions, the hay crop, all sorts of things going on. I still think this is going to be a bone dry summer. Now, we've had 7 inches, almost 8 inches of rain, precipitation, snow over the last 3 to 4 weeks, totally unanticipated. It was drier than a bone. I mean, it was dusty dry in March and April. So our bacon has been saved. The ranching bacon has been saved, at least temporarily, by this much needed moisture. But it is still dry. I can tell you about how long it takes water to go from a ditch across a field to whatever the collection point is. It takes about 3 times as long as in a normal season. I mean, it just crawls along when it ought to be gushing along. I think it's going to be a bone dry summer, despite our temporary reprieve here. And if you remember in my ranch stories here of the last, I don't know, 6, 7 weeks, I brought you up to speed. We got all geared up for a really dry spring and summer because it's a whole kind of different setup with ditches and head gates and pivots and all sorts of things. And then, of course, came the rains. And listen, I hope they keep coming. This is not a complaint, trust me. But we had to re-gear everything to cope with multitudes of water. In fact, we have enough water right now that we're dumping a significant portion back to the creek because we just can't use it. I mean, it's just too much. But I'm not complaining about that either. However, now we're going to have to revamp for the 3rd time because I'm pretty convinced we're going to have a bone dry summer. And that's going to affect a lot of things. It's going to affect the ranching community, the farming community, each and every ranch, depending upon how they have their operation structured. The cow market, we'll talk about that sometime in the future. You might have noticed, a ribeye steak is like $15 friggin' at the grocery store. Yeah, we'll talk about the beef market. Anyway, we are revamping everything for the 3rd time to get ready for bone dry conditions. Because one of the things you have to think about in ranching is like, what's next? It's not like just the emergencies of today. You have to think about how everything you're doing is going to affect where you're going to be in a month or 2 months or 3 months based on your best prognostication of weather conditions, crops, critters, critter health, crop prices, you name it. And if you cut your hay too early, then you lose tonnage, right? It hasn't fully grown. But you get to put water, whatever water you have left after that first crop, back out on the field so you get good regrowth for pasture for the fall and winter. If you cut it too late, you'll get more tonnage in the hay crop. But if it's a bone dry year, you're not going to have any water or very little water to get back over at least a few fields to grow that all important, critical, in fact, fall and winter pasture for horses and cows and other things that like to eat grass, elk, deer, you name it. So since I think it's going to be bone dry, we're gearing up for that eventuality. And the moral of this story is PPPPP. Prior planning prevents poor performance. And you know, if your plan is thrown, should we say, astray by the vagaries of nature, and bring it on, nature, we love it, we love it, then you plan again. Because PPPP, prior planning prevents poor performance, always comes into play, no matter how situations may change. All right. Let's get into some little current rat-a-tat-tat, a couple little things I want to bring your way that, shall we say the mainstream media is glossing over, ignoring, or distorting. Their usual course of PSYOPs action. First of all, this peace deal in Ukraine. And we kind of talked about this in the last show. Okay, the memorandum, the agreement so far is to agree to a memorandum to have a meeting to maybe agree. Well, they can't agree yet on the memorandum. I just thought I'd bring that to you. I wouldn't expect peace in Ukraine tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. It's unfortunate, but Trump's nature, and I like it. I like the bombastic nature. I like him throwing stuff and spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. But a lot of other people don't. And unfortunately, there's a large percentage of the Earth's population who don't think outside the box, don't understand the big picture, are concerned with whatever the football team or the soccer team or whatever country you're living in, whatever that team is doing tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. And, really the mundane things in life, they don't think big picture. And because they don't think big picture, they're easily influenced by number one, psyops media, lying, stealing. Don't even get me started. And they're influenced by personality perceptions because they don't understand what's really happening, what's really trying to be done. And Trump's bombastic nature, over the last 4 weeks, we have seen what should have been solid conservative victories, which may have been very beneficial to the United States in terms of what Trump's trying to do with terrorists and other things, fall apart because the electorate doesn't like Trump. Forget the big picture, forget the success and vitality, prosperity, and freedom of their nation. The orange man is bad and orange man has a big mouth. All right. Well, sometimes orange man does have a big mouth, but that doesn't change the policies or the outcome that everybody should hope for. But unfortunately, the conservative parties who were way ahead and should have won in Australia, in Canada, and in Germany lost their elections in the last 4 weeks. So you now have socialist, liberal, woke, anti-American, really leaning totalitarian governments either back in place or now in place in those countries. We'll see how all that turns out. All right, a few more little current events. Yeah, President Cadaver, right? Death walking. And if you think they didn't know about his cancer and they didn't know about his senility even before he ran for office, well, I'll sell you a bridge somewhere in Arizona. How's that? The bottom line, folks, is in the last year of his quote unquote presidency, really the last year of Obama's third term, there were a lot of executive orders signed. And there were hundreds of executive orders signed in the 100 days from the time Trump won the election to the time he was inaugurated. And many of those were signed with a view to undermining Trump's policies, which were pretty self-evident. I mean, he talked about them on the campaign trail, and he generally does what he says. Not always on time, but he gets done what he says. So this was orchestrated by Obama and the crew he had in the White House, because the staff, and we've talked about this in previous shows, from Susan Rice to the National Security Advisor, the whole 9 yards, it was the same as the Obama team. It was Obama's White House. I mean, that's why he kept his $5 million place in Georgetown, a few miles from the White House, so he could pull the strings based on whatever strings of his were being pulled by Soros and that whole crew. But those executive orders, particularly in the last 100 days, they were signed by the Autopen. You've probably heard a little bit about this. And do you know who first used the Autopen? Yeah, that's right. Barack, baby. Our friend Barry. In 2008, because he was traveling to Hawaii, and couldn't be bothered to do his job that he's getting paid $475,000 a year for, which of course is peanuts compared to the other monies that he gets from other sources. We'll leave that for a future show too. Barry Obama ought to be investigated for treason, and he ought to be tried. And if he's found guilty after due process, then he and a whole bunch of his cabal, including Janet Yellen, who purposely, under Barry's tutelage, sabotaged the financial structure of the United States and the United States Treasury bond and Treasury bill markets by selling short-term instruments, which left us with $9 trillion to refinance at higher rates this year, when she could have been buying 10 and 30-year bonds, 10, 20, and 30-year bonds at almost 0% interest, and we wouldn't have a refinancing problem. Nor would we be spending $1 trillion a year in interest. Yeah, I brought you that in previous shows. I just wanted to remind you because it's, you don't get much more treasonous than that. Unless it is, of course, signing executive orders that the President of the United States never saw, never approved, and never signed because they were signed with an Autopen. And Comers and several other Republicans in the Congress are now investigating that. They've called 4 members of the staff that have been identified as running the Autopen, basically when Barry told them to. And one good thing that may come out of this, besides people getting caught and tried for their crimes, because, you know, the threat to democracy, the Democratic Communists' favorite cry, oh, it's a threat to democracy. Well, you know, people voted for Joe Biden. A cadaver, yes. I mean, they were psyops by the media, and they were bamboozled by the Democratic Communists, who knew all along he was a cadaver, particularly as time went on. These executive orders were designed to impede Trump's progress, which is a dangerous wrinkle in the fabric of where America needs to go and where Trump's trying to bring it. I don't know if he's going to get it done or not. I'm not sure he's going to get it all done. But you know what? He's the first president who's tried since Ronald Reagan. First president who's tried. The others, including Barry, have tried just the opposite. They've deliberately sabotaged, just as they deliberately sabotaged his coming into office with these BS executive orders that the president, the elected president, you know, the threat to democracy, the elected president never saw, never okayed, and never signed. And the other tangent that's good to this, because it's always good to uncover corruption and treason, the other tangent that's good is that they all may be thrown out. Because, you know, an executive order of the President of the United States that the President of the United States never saw, never approved, never signed, by Autopen or otherwise, is not an executive order, is it? No. It would be like me signing an order for the court. I'm not the judge, and my order doesn't mean squat. So think about that. There could be some very interesting things coming down the pike here in the judicial sense. And then South Africa. You know, 2 years ago, I brought you a show. It's a 2-part show. You can listen to it on therightsideradio.com, the archives, which are great. And it was about reparations. The history of reparations was the name of the show. And I used South Africa as an example of reverse reparations in that show. And I told you that the Afrikaners, the Dutch and English Caucasian descendants of the first settlers, who were also landholders, were getting persecuted, killed, raped, thrown out of their land, and their land was being taken by the government without any compensation whatsoever, generational lands. I got a bunch of emails on that show. Oh, you know, you're overplaying this and blah, 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 blah. Well, here we go. Ramaphosa, the leader of South Africa right now, which is a basket case, by the way, in about every way, shape, and form, he met with Trump. And of course, the PSYOPs media, oh, you know, Trump mistreated him and, you know, said things that weren't true and has overplayed the deal and blah, blah, blah. No. What's going on in South Africa is a warning, folks. It's a warning. And if you don't think it can't happen here, if the demographics of this country are dramatically shifted, i.e. illegal immigration, you better think again. And by the way, you don't have to be Caucasian to worry about that. You can be any color, because if you happen to be singled out by whoever is running the show, you know, your life is worth dried snot is what it's worth. And your property will not be your property because they will take it. Hate Desperation, a lust for power, and greed are really powerful things. And the folks who possess those feelings, they don't much care what happens to the people on the other side of those feelings. Along those lines, last little thought and rat-a-tat-tat. What if this massive illegal immigration that we suffered under Barry's third term, 12 to 15 million, I mean, we don't even know. What if that was really a mask for the 3, 4, 500,000 folks they really wanted to bring into the country? You know, these people are communists. Now, you may say, oh, you know, read's a conspiracy theory. No, these people are communists. You can read their books. Read Janet Yellen's theses in college. It's like reading Karl Marx, and you wonder if her T-bill deal, the sabotage of the American bond market, was an accident. Read Barry's books, you know, Dreams of My Father. They tell you who they are. You just have to read it in their own words. Because they are communists, they have a long-term game plan. Part of it is education. I think you know what's happened there. Fortunately, that's being reversed too, although slowed down by these Autopen executive orders we were talking about. But part of it, folks, is that communists almost always, very rarely is there an exception to this rule, come to power through violence and in many cases, revolution. And what if the 3 to 500,000, we don't know who and we don't know how many, but we do know there was 30 to 40,000 military aged, in perfect condition, well-dressed, kind of like in uniform, Chinese that immigrated to this country. I brought you that story. And we do know that there was lots of criminals and terrorists on the watch list that illegally invaded this country. And, you know, you get 300,000 or 400,000 people, many of them militarily trained, many of them with military backgrounds of some type, all of them kind of leaning toward violence, none of them having much respect for Americans or America or the Constitution. In fact, they loathe it, they hate it. You could have quite a ruckus here, couldn't you? Because sure as hell, the woke bunch, the useful idiots, as Lenin called his followers, that follow Barry Obama, even though a tiny minority in this country, they don't have the gumption, the skills, the fortitude, the will, nor are there enough of them to, shall we say, foment what would have to happen in the event of some type of violent attempt at takeover of the government. Election fraud is treason, but election fraud is not violence. Anyway, you can think about that. We're going to talk more about it in coming shows. And now let's get into what led up to World War I. And as I go through this history with you, take the names of these countries and these alliances and substitute in your mind as you listen the names of the current actors on the world stage: Iran, China, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, etc., the United States. And substitute in place of the alliances that I'm going to bring your attention to that led up to World War I, bring together NATO, or inject, kind of as you listen, the word NATO. Inject the word Israel, should we say Greater Israel. Inject the word BRICS, the BRICS nations. China. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about, what I'm trying to get you to understand as I bring you this history leading up to the second greatest conflagration the earth has ever known. So World War I was caused by a combination of several factors, but primarily it was caused by the hegemon, at that time Britain, being threatened by a rising hegemon, Germany, okay, at that time Prussia. And Europe got divided into two camps. Okay, there was the Great Britain, France, and Russia alliance. That's right, Russia alliance. And that was called the Triple Entente. And then there was the German Empire, the Austria-Hungary Empire, and Italy. And that was called the Central Entente, or the Central Powers. This whole thing kind of kicked off the turmoil that was coming. It kicked off with a war that was called the Franco-Prussian War. And that was a war between France and Prussia, later to become the German Empire, that went from about 1870 to 1871. France got its butt kicked. It lost a large portion of its navy. It was really the downfall of the French semi-hegemon status in Europe. And it created a powerful German empire with industrial and military capabilities. I mean, right? One rises, one falls. Then you had the accession, the rise to power of Wilhelm II to the German throne. And he was kind of a bombastic guy. You know, he said what he wanted. He threatened who he wanted to threaten. And he was quite secure in the rising power of the German Empire. And, you know, you can substitute names as we go here, right, for current events. And he dismissed probably the best statesman of that entire time period, Otto von Bismarck. There was later a battleship named for him that was sunk by the British Navy in World War II. Great movie, great story, in fact. He also did not renew what was called the reinsurance treaty with Russia that kind of kept the peace between Russia and Austria-Hungary, you know, a tentative peace between those two powers. And it kept France isolated, kind of out on its own, because France and Britain at that time were not, shall we say, the best of friends. But what happened is, as he made his moves, he created an alliance unintentionally, right? Unintended consequences between France and Russia. And that became the basis of the Triple Entente, which Britain later joined and pretty much led. And then we have the Russo-Japanese War, right? Didn't know about that probably. Huge conflict between Russia and Japan, the Empire of Japan, and Tsarist Russia. And this was over who would control Manchuria and Korea and their resources. Oh, really? People were fighting about resources back then? How odd. Where have we heard that before? Anyway, that was in 1904 to 1905. Well, Japan kicked Russia's butt. Russia lost almost all of its Baltic and Pacific fleet, and basically led to a political crisis, because Russians don't like to lose wars, as we kind of noticed here over the past few years. That created the revolution in Russia of 1905. But it also stopped all of Russia's ambitions in the Far East, which of course started, remember, this is 100 years ago, China's rise to power and the enmity between China and Japan, right? The two powers conflicting. Well, the other thing it did was, since Russia was kind of kicked out of the Mideast, not the Mideast, but the East, it turned its attention to, oh, that's right, the Baltic states, which are now Poland and Moldavia and Romania and all those countries, and to Europe. Do you think its focus has changed, folks? Or do you think it's getting, shall we say, laser focused? Yeah, right, exactly. And this started because of the Balkan thing which Austria-Hungary, right, part of the Central Powers, they thought was really kind of their backyard. This started the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia. And then we have the Entente Cordiale. This is the British and the French, right? The enemy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Perfect. So the rise in German military capabilities and industrial mights convinced Great Britain that Germany could establish itself as the preeminent power in Europe. Well, Britain couldn't have that because Britain was the preeminent power in Europe. And they entered into an alliance with France that became known as the Entente Cordiale. That was 1907. And they entered into an alliance with Russia. And those alliances became that Triple Entente that we were talking about here just a few minutes ago. And that was the core of the Allied forces, as they were called, in World War I. Then we have the Moroccan crises. There were two of them, actually. The Tangled crisis, 1905, 1906, and the Agadir crisis, which was 1911. Almost the precipitation of World War I, but not quite. So both of those crises were provoked by the Germans, and it was provoked on purpose. Their aim was to cause tensions between France and Britain, who had just concluded the alliance that we were talking about. But, once again, unintended consequences, just the opposite occurred. It didn't soften Britain and bring it closer to the Central Powers. Those Moroccan crises reinforced the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France and increased British hostility toward Germany. And then we have the Bosnian annexation crisis. So Bosnia, think about the Baltics out there, all those countries, okay? Part of the Soviet Union, now free, Poland arming to fight the Soviet Union, to fight Russia, the Russia Federation right now. I mean, I just love the way this history plays out. And it also plays out, by the way, with the cycles. Several shows ago, you can listen to it on the archives on the rightsideradio.com. I brought you where all the cycles converged last, 400 years ago. The Kondratiev wave, several minor economic waves, the fifth, shall we say, fourth turning, if you go back 80 years at a clip, all the way back. Well, what was going on here in the first 10 to 20 years of 1900? That was two Kondratiev waves ago, 50-year waves, and that was, right, the fourth turning before the one we are in right now. It's amazing how these cycles work, how history is a rinse and repeat. It more than rhymes, it repeats. Anyway, this Bosnian annexation crisis. In 1908, Austria-Hungary, once again, they thought this was their backyard. They just annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I probably mispronounced that. And that was formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, which was an empire that was in rapid decline at that time. A hegemon on its way down in a death spiral. The annexation of those provinces in 1878, actually, was bitterly opposed by Serbia. And that was, Serbia considered itself ethnically related, very close to, and geographically adjacent to those provinces. Haven't we heard that from some? Oh, that's right. The Donbass in Ukraine and Russia. Amazing. Russia failed to win as firm a support because Russia opposed all this. But they failed to win support from Britain and France, at least to the extent that would make a difference. But Vienna, Austria-Hungary, had a lot of support from Germany. And the annexation stuck, and it created a bitterness and a rancor that grew and grew and festered for decades, 2 decades to be exact. Serbia, by the way, was forced to back down in its protests. But once again, the rancor, the hatred grew. And you know, when you become enemies with and you hate another country, and you can see this in human life just between individuals, it generally doesn't get tamped down, it just kind of accelerates because humans are humans. You can kind of rely on that. Which brings us to the Italo-Turkish War. Turkish War. 1911, 1912. And this was not really a major threat to peace in Europe, but what it did was it stirred the pot of all the other elements we've been talking about and a few more to come that created instability. And you know, power fills vacuums, and instability, shall we say, does mischief. Think about the world right now, how unstable it is in all sorts of respects, regions, and ways. Same thing back then, condensed. So the Italo-Turkish War, basically, the Turks got defeated, right? This was the end swan song for the Turkish Empire. And I better plug this machine in or we're going to lose each other here. There we go. But it was a swan song for the Ottoman Empire, right? The final fall of the hegemon. And the war between the Kingdom of Italy and the Ottoman Empire became a strong incentive for a formation of a Balkan League. That's right, all those little countries, the Balkans, they said, the hell with you big guys, and they formed their own little defensive league, which was quite successful, much to the concern of the greater powers, Germany, Britain, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Which brings us to the Balkan Wars. In 1912, Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, and Bulgaria formed this Balkan League. And this was a military alliance against, they said, the Ottoman Empire, which at that time was pretty much toast anyway. It was really a military alliance against the other alliances that had sprung up. It was like all the mice got together to fight the big rats. In a few months, these allies stripped the Ottoman Empire, which was basically nothing at that time, of all its land and territorial possessions in all the Balkans, and they divided the conquered territory amongst themselves, which has become really the countries which exist today, right? And the countries which were freed from the Soviet Union when it collapsed during Reagan's tenure. However, treachery knows no bounds, whether it's people who deal with one another or countries who deal with one another, and neither does greed nor the lust for power. In June of that same year, after winning this victory, Bulgaria, quite treacherously, turned against its allies, the other Balkan League countries, particularly Serbia and Greece, over a supposed dispute over a boundary in Macedonia. But the Bulgarians were defeated within a month. They got their butts kicked. And they gave up their claims, but the success of the Balkan League shocked the big boys, the real European powers. And they decided they needed to smash this little fledgling that dared interfere in their geopolitics and military maneuvers. So the Balkan Wars made Austria-Hungary even more determined to take concrete action to make sure Serbia, the strongest of the Balkans, didn't get any stronger, okay? The big hegemon making sure the little hegemon didn't get any bigger. Which brings us to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, which was the real kind of trigger, if you will, for World War I. So on June 28th, 1914, a group of conspirators, 6 of them, they assassinated the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne, which was Franz Ferdinand, and his wife in Sarajevo. You know where Sarajevo is. In fact, Sarajevo was the site of the Olympics just a few years ago, if you recall. When it was discovered that the main perp in this assassination, a guy by the name of Princip, P-R-I-N-C-I-P, and his 5 associates were all Serbs, Bosnian Serbs, and that they were part of the, it was a group that shall we say, was fringe revolutionary in Serbia. But that didn't matter to Austria. That didn't matter to the Central Powers, because they gleefully blamed Serbia for pulling off the stunt, even though Serbia said, we had nothing to do with it. These guys are like, they're extremists in our country, you know, do with them as you will. But that's not what the Central Powers wanted. They wanted a reason to go to war. They wanted a reason to extend their tentacles of power across all of Europe and to vanquish the Triple Entente, Russia, France, and Britain, right? A war of the hegemons of Europe. Well, that's exactly what happened, okay? And that was the precipitation, the real precipitation of World War I. It was actually the cornerstone of the final event, which led to the outbreak of hostilities in 1914. On July 23rd of that year, this is shortly after Ferdinand's assassination, Hungary, Austria-Hungary, presented an ultimatum to Serbia, because once again, they were playing on this assassination as a false flag to blame Serbia, and they were looking for an excuse to declare war. However, the ultimatum that they gave Serbia had a bunch of things that Serbia had to agree to, which were purposely designed, it's later been discovered in papers and documents, to not be agreed to, which would be like the final nail in the coffin of saying, okay, you know, we tried to be peaceful, but here we come. And sure enough, a few days after Serbia said, what are you, crazy? I can't agree to this. It's like you're asking me to commit suicide. A few days later, that's right, Austrian and Hungarian troops invaded Serbia. And the war was on, folks. And all the secret alliances and the not so secret alliances and the conflicting alliances all went at it tooth and nail. That's right. And that's how World War I began. And I've hit the major points for you. But if you were playing the little mind game that I asked you to do, and you substituted the names of countries and people and events that are happening right now into this historical story, you can see why it has importance in understanding where we are, where we might go, hopefully not, where we might go, and how we got here. The next show in a couple of days, I'm going to talk about just those subjects, where we are. You now know how we got here. You now know the history of a very similar period 100 years ago, 2 cycles ago. And we're going to discuss what the potential outcome is and why. And that includes the tariffs. That includes the economic warfare that's being waged right now. That includes the rise of hegemon China threatening hegemon US, the treachery of Europe. Think about Bulgaria there turning on its allies. The treachery of Europe and Russia's role shall we say, in the whole mess that now exists, bearing in mind that Russia should rightfully be the ally of the United States, not the ally of China. Russia has far more in common with the West than they do with China. And Russia full well knows the menace that China is to Russia eventually. They share a big border. Russia is a country of 140 million, and China is a country of 1.4 billion. Russia has a standing army of, give or take, 3 million right now because they're on a total war footing. And China has a standing army of 10 million with reserves of 200 million. What could possibly go wrong? And Russia has a whole bunch of resources because the West has been touting about how they're going to take them from Russia, right? They have a whole bunch of resources that China would really like to have. What could go wrong, folks? What could go wrong? All right, this is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Thanks for listening. Appreciate you all. Keep the wind at your back. We'll talk to you in a few days.
Please remember, if you've missed any shows, just click on Show Archive and you'll find all of his shows. We look forward to seeing you here again next week for another episode of Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.